Did you switch it over?
Yeah, we're good.
All right, cool.
Good morning, Columbus web groupers, Ohio web groupers, United States web groupers, citizens of the world web groupers. This morning we are here for 1,000 ways to make this, the do's and don'ts of web UI, and we're here with Kevin Mack, who will be leading you through how to develop things in a browser for products, with people, with goals in mind, for the world, not just Ohio or Columbus. So, thank you guys for joining us early on a Saturday morning. If you have any questions, if you have any if you have any comments or anything you want to ask Kevin specifically, you can drop it in the chat. I will be watching it and passing those things on to Kevin while he presents. Again, thank you so much. And I'm about to bring Kevin in to start the talk. Instead, what I'll do is I'll do my Beto O'Rourke impression. Just kidding, I'll stop there. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Kevin Mack.
Cool. All right, Steve, that was an interesting introduction, but thank you. Yeah, so this weekend workshop is about 1,000 ways to make this. The general idea is in CSS and HTML, there's many ways to get the same output. So I say this many, many times. I'm kind of a broken record when I talk about learning CSS and coding. But I say CSS and HTML are some of the easiest languages to learn. You can learn them within maybe 5 minutes. But then to master them, it takes nearly a lifetime of learning. And I started web development in 95. In 96, CSS came out. So I'm over 20 years of using CSS. And over these years, I've learned a lot of the do's and don'ts of it, and really the best practices from the standards that exist, and then just from writing code, really lessons learned. So today, even though that there are many different ways to get the same output, there's probably only a handful of correct ways of doing it. So the agenda for this is to show a basic interface, something that seems really simple, but is actually a really complex thing to solve. So we're going to talk about browser compatibility, different CSS properties, different methodologies associated with CSS, and then, unlike other workshops I've done in the past, actually write CSS code and talk about different properties associated with it. With this, I know that there's people that are inside the YouTube, I guess, live stream right now. If you have questions or comments, please do not hesitate to comment or ask anything and disrupt. So I have Andy here, who's kind of queuing up everything. He's the Andy Richter of the day, so he'll be jumping in to tell jokes in between. And then we also have Steve, who you just saw up here, aka Beto O'Rourke. That's an inside joke from this morning, but they're here moderating all the comments. So please ask questions. If I'm moving too fast, just be like, slow down, and I will. Even though this is called 1,000 ways, I don't know if we'll actually get to all 1,000 ways. So that's basically it. I gave a quick summary of myself, but my name is Kevin Mack. I'm Nice Transition on everything social media, as well as GitHub. That includes GitHub, Instagram, Twitter. I've been slow on the Twitters, but you know, we have politicians that use that nowadays, and that's fun. So I'm gonna get started here. Are you guys good? All right, sweet. All right, so on my screen here is this layout that we use to advertise this workshop, and it had this hello world. That's actually going to be the graphic that we make and kind of start off. I did share the agenda earlier on, but this is really the agenda for today. So we're going to make a design and we're going to talk about it. So if anyone has any inputs in here, feel free. But basically, I'm just going to be designing this little box inside here. Seems simple, but it's actually way more complex than you would think. I'm going to go over some basic introduction pieces for CSS, so just a foundational. So if you've never written any CSS code, this would be really, really helpful for you. And then these are going to get into the tips while writing CSS. So just some things I've learned over the years. And then what we'll do is create some base styling. So things like the background color and the font, just that are going to be utilized across the entire demo. And then after that, we're going to get into various approaches, starting with the old school table. So table is really helpful if anyone out there has to write emails and create content for emails. That's still the best way and best practice for doing emails across all the different email clients that exist out there. The next one is a more traditional approach, so using blocks, so display blocks, inline, and then the position CSS properties and how to do that. There's some fun, cool, interesting ways that, when you're looking at a text that's centered both centered horizontally and vertically in the middle, it is way more challenging than it seems. And there's some properties that came out about 12 years ago that make it happen using display, using blocks. Next, we'll get into really more modern and probably the best practice if you can align to modern day browsers using Flex, and then Grid, which nowadays has pretty much full support, but I'll talk about the caveats with Grid and why I kind of still use Flex over Grid. And then this section 9 is just going to be going crazy and writing a bunch of different ways on how to really do the UI in various ways, and we'll cover different CSS properties that weren't covered in the beginning. And then kind of, going into the do's and don'ts and summarizing it, and then opening up to questions, and if there's anything that anyone wants me to build, like build out something really quick, or a question like, hey, how would I do this? I can definitely do that for you. I'm going to hide my bookmarks here, though. I just realized that those are showing. There we go. Add some more space here. All right, so first thing is I'm going to open up Sketch. So even though this is about HTML and CSS, in my background, I guess people know me as a designer, other people know me as a developer, but my primary focus has been on interface design and development, and a hardcore focus on interface design. So I do a lot of graphic design, but I would say majority of all my work that I do today is actually all interface design, and I'm a Sketch fan. So I'm gonna just make this. Sketch is really, really awesome if you haven't used it. There's a lot of things that just come out of like the box when you have it. So like even these, dimensions, popular sizes for browsers, which are really nice. So by just doing that, it makes this window for me. Inside here, I'm just going to create this rectangle. So imagining that this is the browser window, and this is the box that we have here. So by default, and you can override your settings in Sketch, which is cool, but I keep them to the default. Based off that graphic, it was black with a red border and the words "Hello World" inside there. So I'm just going to create something like that really quickly, and then I'm going to discuss this typically as if I was a designer on a project and I would meet with a developer, I would review my design with them and talk about what I was trying to do for it to be converted from a design into the browser. I'm going to use a traditional red, and this will become really important in the demo, and I'm going to make this be 2 pixels wide. So right now we just have a black box with a red border, and then I'm just going to enter in hello world and a period there. Actually, let's not put a period because it's not that needed. And I'm going to switch this over to an Arial font just because it's a web standard font. And this is at 16 pixels. Let's make it 32 pixels. So it's a little bit bigger. And right now you can see with these red lines that this is centered both horizontally and vertically. Now, if this was my design, it's not really that amazing of a design, of course, but there's some interesting things to look at. I'm going to set this actually to a width of 700 pixels. And then again, center it here. And in reality, what I want to do is I'm going to crop this to be the size of this. And then I'm going to increase this by 200 pixels and then center it right here. So right now we have this design. And so in this, I'm playing the role of a designer and I'm talking to a developer. And I say, this is what I want my interface to look like. It is a black box with a red border of 2 pixels with the words hello world in white at 32 pixels. And on the top and bottom, I want a padding or a gutter of 100 pixels. So this box is also 700 pixels wide. So then there's other questions that, we could get into if this was a more complex design and talking about responsive. But for right now, this is just kind of the design. So I'm going to just change this here and it's text and group this. All right. And from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to export this and I'll use this later on in an example of really the don'ts. So using an image inside your interface as one of the examples. So for right now, I'm just going to export this out and I'm going to save it inside of our project. Nothing really that great here. We'll just put it here. Typically, if I'm saving out images, I usually have an images directory and I save it there and I give it a naming convention so that it's sorted and easily found and break it down based off of temporary images like things for campaigns. But for purposes of this, we don't really care. Quick call outs, I get this question a lot about what Interlace Png means. And this is the same in Photoshop as well as in almost any design program for today. Interlace means that when you're downloading the image inside the browser, you kind of see it build up. So if I have a full color image of like 2 people standing there, you'll see it go from very pixelated to refine. The image itself is much larger than a non-interlace image, but the good thing about this is the image shows up quicker and then kind of builds. So it's kind of a cool thing to have. I typically don't do that, and I just usually optimize my images using something like Image Optim. So I'm just going to say that there. All right, so now we have this graphic, again, 700 pixels wide with a 2 pixel border, and then we have the words hello world in Arial, white, and it's also bold. Oops. And you know what? I will save the sketch file, oops, just so we can have a copy of it inside the repo that I made. So everything for this project is also being saved out on GitHub. So as I'm doing my demos today, you will see these go out to the GitHub that was shared. So it's just nice transition.github.cwg, so Columbus Web Group -ww for Weekend Workshop -2019. So that's kind of the name of this GH page that's out there. And right now, this just has the agenda and this basic demo, which is blank. So as we go through these, I'll be building them out. All right, am I at a good pace, everyone? So far, no questions, any complaints?
No questions. Did you publish that GitHub?
It's publicly accessible, so the repo itself isn't. I will make it public, but for right now, it's just the GH pages.
There's also like a 30-second to 1 minute delay.
Yeah.
It's worse on this TV.
Yeah.
It's not as bad on my laptop.
Well, Andy, we can't all be you.
Kevin Schwartz says good.
Okay. I'll wait a minute and say thank you. All right, so inside this project, and this is a pretty basic setup, and this is, you can kind of ignore this idea of this index file there, but the CSS file inside here is what I'm using to style, and this file, which is generated through a task. That's something that we can also cover in a future Columbus web group, I guess weekend workshop if we want to do that. So the first thing is typically, I have my HTML document, and CSS applies to any language that has a front end, and HTML is the output, or is the coding language that you have to have your output that's viewed inside the browser, where CSS is the styling of the interface itself and the branding and all the things that make it nice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file, and I'm just going to call this core.css, which we'll be using as kind of the core basis of this, of these demos. I'm using VS Code. I used to be a hardcore Sublime user, but I moved over to VS Code about 8 months ago, and rarely use Sublime unless I have a file that I need to open that's like 1,000,000 lines. VS Code's bad with things like that, but VS Code's free. It's amazing, and there's a lot of cool features inside here. So getting into really the first section here, as I said, we would be covering an intro to CSS. So we made the graphic, and now we'll talk about CSS. So there's different ways of including CSS. There's inline styles. So you can put a style attribute on an element. That is not recommended and rarely used. The only time that there's really a use case for that is if you have a JavaScript, maybe library that you wrote that you need to override some kind of CSS property that's foundational for the library. You can also do an inline style tag inside the project itself at the top, and that's how we'll be doing the demos today. That is not recommended. I'm only doing that for the purpose of demos. The best way of doing it is to have an external CSS file, so filename.css, and then you make a reference to it inside the header of your HTML file. And I will show you how to apply that in just a second. So here we're in the CSS file. In CSS, there's a few important things just for an introductory level. You have what would be referred to as a selector. The most common are classes. So a class starts with a period, and then you give it a name. So in this case, I'm just going to call it selector name. And that is a selector. And this is a class because there's a period before it. And then I add opening and closing curly brackets. And this is the core piece. So this is a definition of a CSS selector, and this being a class. Inside the curly brackets, you have properties and keys. So a CSS property could be something like color, and then you put a colon, and then you put the value of it. So this would be if I wanted the color to be red. Anywhere where I apply this class inside my HTML, the color red is then applied to it. With CSS, you can also put commas. So I can put another class called like another class. And that means anywhere where I use another class as well as selector name, it is sharing this CSS property of color red. Additional, I guess, selectors, and there's many of them out there. An ID starts with the hashtag. And whatever name you want to give this. This uses the ID attribute in your HTML, where these use the class attribute in your HTML. And we'll just say background color, blue. And I can apply that there. One of my favorite, and I reference this all the time, is this website. It's kind of dated now, but I still use it when I'm teaching people CSS. It's called 30 Selectors you must memorize. And this covers primarily the core CSS selectors that are out there, because I could just do a class on various ones. And once we go into the weird ways in the agenda today, so this weird approaches, we'll be covering a bunch of these and also applying, the differences between classes, IDs, and the various selectors out there. So it's a quick read, and they give you nice little demos, and they tell you the browser compatibility, which isn't as important today in modern web. All right, so here we have these basic things, and then we have our first little demo here. So to apply this CSS in here, what I need to do is add a link element, and then you have this href, which is a reference to an external file. This is similar to, it's kind of weird that they use href here as opposed to source, like almost any other attribute. And it's just because it's in the header, the link element has a reference to a file using href. Looking at my directory structure here, so I created core.css in the root of this. Typically, again, I would have something like source, and then inside source, I would have something like styles and put my CSS files inside there, similar to like scripts and having my JavaScript inside here. But just to keep all my source files in one spot, put it in there. Because it is below one level, I have to go like this, ... and say core.css. So by doing this, I've added this CSS reference inside here. I'm going to go to this little demo. Oops. That's nice. I'm actually going to move that file because I did not think about that. Uno momento. Cool. All right. So here I'm in this file right here, this basic demo, which is this file right here. I'm going to open this, and right now we don't have anything really being applied here. So one of the first things I'm going to do to kind of get this project set up is I'm going to add a body, and just to show you how this will update, I'm going to add a background color lime because that is a beautiful color. So inside this demo, I'm referencing the core CSS, which is in the root, so that's why it's down one level, and it's bringing that in there, and it's bringing and applying these styles inside here. So if we think back to the design that we had here, the background color is white. By default, a browser has a background color white. I don't necessarily need to override that or apply a property, a stylistic property to it because it's by default that way. How I know that is if I open up in the browser, and I'm just going to change this to a different color because that hurts my eyes. We'll make it 666. So inside the browser, there's what's referred to as user agent styles, which are default stylistic things that are built inside every single browser. So these are the standards of CSS, the actual language that are included in every single browser. These standards are open source. I've worked on 2 approved CSS properties over the years, and anyone can contribute to them and suggest new ideas that are out there. When they do get approved by the community and all the organizers of the W3C and a wide range of people, they get added to every single browser in future updates, which is really, really cool. And I can see this, so I'm using Chrome. You can also see this in Safari, as well as a few people that use Firefox. And I know some people really like it, but that's for another day. That's a beer conversation. If I right-click inside of Chrome, so when I go to inspect, it's going to bring up this kind of dialog here, and this shows my HTML from my document. And if I highlight these, you can see these properties that are coming up. So some of them are proprietary to the actual browser itself. Safari and Internet Explorer do this frequently. Nowadays, Edge has been a lot better with it, but the old versions of IE had their own stylistic things that you had to know to override. And the only way of doing it was opening it up and inspecting them. If I look at body right here, you can see that it has this margin, 8 pixels. And then it has a display block. So that's just one of the stylistic things. But then you can see that it has this background color of 666. This is coming from core.css, which is that file that I created. And I'm applying the CSS property on the body type selector here to give me this result. So this is the property and this is the value, and it's coming from this file. But I can see this user agent style sheet, which are some definitions that I didn't write anywhere. So a lot of times when getting started in a project, I like to override things like margin. Just to show you some other examples of user agent, we'll do a classic H1 for a header and say hi, and then we'll add a paragraph and say this, and I'll hit save. So we can see that this is hi and this. Now, if I look at my font here, it is in a serif font, and that's just because all browsers by default do that. Even though it can be a long debate about stylistically sans serif versus serif. If a browser were to change serif to sans serif by the user agent, it would literally be one of the worst things ever on the web because people are overriding that on their own. So if I look at the HTML and I go down here and I go to body, it's all right. So this is the only thing that's been defined, and this. So if I look at H1 and I look at the definition of it, it has all these stylistic things attached to it. So by default, an H1 has how Chrome interprets it is a margin block start. It used to be margin, I can't remember the old name for it, but basically what this is margin top and margin bottom. Chrome gives you the ability to override the user agent's default values for certain things that are kind of globally and well known for elements like H1's P tags, body tags. But if you're trying to make something that works across all browsers, you just have to know how those kind of interpret. You also see that the H1 has by default a font weight of bold and a font size of 2M. And M is just a font size for the web. If I look at computed here, this gives me the full definition of everything that's being applied to every single property on the page. So I can scroll down, let me open this up, and how my browser is actually inheriting these. So by default, you'll have these and it'll show you the color, and you can also click on where that's coming from. So that's coming from internal root color, the user agent. And what this is actually referencing is on your computer, your device, the settings from the actual system that you're working on. So why that's important is for accessibility and people that may have issues seeing colors. They can add programs to enhance accessibility, and the browser actually interprets that for them. So if I wanted to, I can actually go into OS X and define my default color for all applications from black, because maybe I can't see black and I want to make it red. The browser will always do it. Same thing with different other fonts that are out there. But that's really cool that you can click this and go there, and you can see all the properties that are defined by the user agent. There's a handful of other properties that every element has. So if I click on Show All, you can see every single piece of CSS that is being defined by every single HTML element. So these are all the different things that render this on the page. Not really that relevant besides the ones that are highlighted. but it's also a good reference if you're ever wondering or trying to debug something. We look at paragraph. I'm going to untoggle this. And if I look at the styles here, you can see that it's something similar to the H1, but its own define. Another good thing is to look at how they do these paddings inside here in the margins. So remember earlier I was talking about the interpretation of how Chrome does this. If I look at computed, you can see that by default, a paragraph or a P tag has a margin top of 16 pixels on top and bottom, which is equivalent to 1em. So 1em is the root base font size at a 1x. So by default, a browser has a root font size of 16. If I were to define the root font size as 18, then we would see this being 18 on the top and bottom. Give you a quick little example of that. I'll use the root selector and say font size 20 pixels. And we go back to paragraph and we look at this, it's now 20. And that is the interpretation of the M there. I could also apply this to the body and would do the same. The difference between M and the difference between this, an M and a rem, is an M looks at the closest parent font size and does that multiplication. So if I have 2M's inside of 2M's, it's going to be actually at a 4x size. If I do a rem, it is looking at the root, the highest node or element of your DOM. All right, so I've done many different tutorials on kind of Chrome and the intros to CSS. I feel like with that kind of foundation, this is enough to get inside this. And if anyone has any questions about anything that I just talked about, let us know and we can circle back to it. And if you're really lost, add some exclamation marks and I will pause what I'm talking about and help you out. So please let us know if you're missing anything, but I think that should be good enough as a foundation to get actually into this demo. All right. So again, I don't really need to define this, but for sake of being explicit, we'll add the background color of white on side here. And remember in the demo that I showed earlier, the font family here was Arial. So what I'm going to do is apply that style to this. So we're going to say font family, Arial. And then I'm going to have a backup and just say sans serif. So for some reason, if you're a hater of Arial and you never want to see it, you can delete it from your system, even though it's installed in everyone's computer and device. You can still delete it. And if someone has it deleted from their machine, it's going to come up as serif, which is the default font. So even though Arial is on 100% of devices, there's probably someone out there that doesn't have it. That's why you put sans serif, so that's the fallback. The comma and font family has serif after, or sans serif after, because Arial is a sans serif font, and it interprets that way. So when I save that, you can see that we're now in an Arial font, background color is white, nothing else has changed. If I wanted to, I could add a color right here of red, and fonts inherit from the outermost or the closest parent, similar to how the M's do. So that's just how CSS reads and translates into the interface. We don't want red, just wanted to show you that as a demo. And then do you remember earlier when I was saying one of the first things I always do when I'm inside of here is this default margin? I'm going to override this. This is where I will say CSS is a language of extending and not overriding. So what I mean by that is, do you see this slash right here? In CSS, you want to avoid those slashes as much as possible. But it is okay when you have it from the user agent. So this is kind of what would be referred to as a reset or maybe even a normalize. It's just finding that foundational piece that you know across your entire application or the interface that you're building that you want it to override that. Type selectors are also okay to override. So body is a type selector. A type selector means it uses the element from the HTML, so the HTML element of body, and this selector being body, that's a type selector. And I'm overriding the margin right here. And if I were to look at the body in the computed for this, if I was wondering where that came from, I could click this and we'll highlight that it comes from this. I use the shorthand for it, but Chrome has these nice little tools where it shows you all the breakdowns if you ever want to know the extended version. All right, so from a foundational standpoint, we have the Arial, we have the background color. I've overwritten the user agent margin, which pushes this kind of close to the top. I'm also going to do one other thing. So this is an approach that I like to do because I like to manually reset all my headers and paragraphs to a size. So I'm just going to do that right here. And earlier I said that this had a default spacing attached to it. So again, I can go like right here, and you can see that it has this 0.6 em. So if I look at that, it has a 21 at the top, and the paragraph, remember, had the 1 em, 16 on top and bottom. And for this demo, I'm just going to say margin, top 0, and margin, bottom 0. So that removes the spacing on the top and bottom. Andy, you gave me a weird look.
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
By the way, Kevin, Columbus Fireman 13 says, thanks, Kev. I already learned something today.
Oh. Cool.
Not my job.
Yeah. So right now I've reset the margin of the top and kind of did a reset or a normalize. Fireman, what was his name? Fireman?
Columbus Fireman 13.
Oh, Columbus Fireman. Huh, interesting name. Are you a fireman? Or is that like a band? I'm distracted. Well, cool. All right, so I'm just resetting this. So now the margin and top are set up here, and we have kind of the space set up for what we'll be building next. So inside here, I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to start by adding a div. And there's different various elements I can use. Traditionally, a div works great. I think div actually stands for divider. Not 100% sure where that one came around, but it's been around since the early days of the web. And inside here, I'm just going to put an H1, which you only have one H1 per page, and I'm just going to write the words hello world. So that's kind of my DOM structure here. And you can see this output of hello world here. You can't see the div, but a div has a block type display. So if I add a border around here just for demo purposes, you'll see that it goes from one side to the other side. So a div spans the entire width of the parent container. Because this div isn't in something else, it just goes to the body. It's filling out the full browser width. Now, for this div, I'm going to keep this as a type selector. And I'm just going to say background color, black. Now,
Columbus Fireman is Josh.
oh, Josh. Cool.
He
Interesting name,
apologizes for
Josh.
his antiquated name.
Yeah.
And then he says football team. I don't know what that's related to.
The fireman, the football fireman.
Mm.
Cool. So inside here, I made the div a background color of black. If you can do shorthands with hex values, meaning that if the explicit way of writing this is 6, so all hex values are actually at a 6 level. But if it repeats, you can just do the first 3. I can also type it out as black. So any of the traditional colors you can do that way. So we'll just keep it as black. But right now you can't see my font, even though it's still here, hello world. And that's because we never defined the font color here. So let's add a color of black here, just to show you one other thing, and then we'll add the CSS property of color and add white here. And I'll remove this and just type in white. So now we see hello world right there.
So is there any reason where you would want to use an explicit hex code versus a word color?
No, I would say I would recommend using the hex value over this, just because most interfaces aren't just going to be using the solid like 000 black. And well, besides black and white, those are the only ones. There isn't any gain. It's not anything for performance. It's just more or less kind of weird to see it. Yeah. And a lot of times when people are starting off with CSS, they use the names written out as opposed to knowing the hex values. But as you can see, like in Visual Studio or VS Code, when I hover over these, it brings up this kind of color wheel, and then it actually makes it for me. So RGB stands for red, green, blue, and then these are the red, the green, the blue here. And then I think there's a setting inside here, yep, to the hex value up here. So, and then all the various ways that you can get that. So in the early days of web development, I remember there were websites that you would go to because design programs weren't really made for the web. A lot of those early ones were just still for print. And RGB, I'm not sure if it existed. I didn't realize that was a value for color probably until about like 99. So I used those in the early days because I knew the colors. And then there were certain websites that came out there where it was like you were looking for a color and they would have like teals and references to all the color blocks out there because there wasn't a way to really interpret what the colors were. So that's why I use them, but never really use them anymore. All right, so another thing, I'm kind of getting into the demo portion of this, so I'm going to move this block of code and go into here. So that's really all I needed from my core CSS, and we may reference that later on and come back to it and add another one. But I'm going to do the thing that I said don't do, which is a style tag on here. And I just copied that CSS from that other page and put it here. So now we have the style element, and I have my CSS here, so you can do that on any page. Again, this is for demo purposes because I'm going to create a bunch of these different files out here to just get this out here. So in Sketch, earlier on, this was at 700 wide. We're going to make this 700 wide. So we use the width property, 700 pixels. So you can see that that is now defined. Now, in this graphic, this was supposed to be centered. So this was, I mean, it's many years ago, but this was one of those best things that ever came across in my life was how to center something in CSS. Margin right, margin left, auto. Oops. So what that's doing is a margin you usually define as a unit. By putting it to auto, it does this weird trick of it doesn't know how to interpret the auto, so it just tries to span and fill that entire area. So when you have an element such as this div, so this type selector div and this HTML element here defined as 700, what it's trying to do is, all right, so I have some kind of margin on the side, so margins of the distance or the gutters. When it's set to auto, it's combating and kind of pushing that 700 pixel in the center of the page. And that's literally how it's interpreted and works. Nowadays, that's still used in some of the, like I use margin right, auto, and flex, and it gives you a lot of these different cool ways of defining placement of elements. So right now, this is pretty basic, and we're going to add the last piece inside here, which we will call border. And if you remember, it was 2 pixels, solid, red. So now this is kind of the start of this. But you can see that this isn't centered in the page. So for me to center it, I have to do text align center. There we go. Now, if I show this to my designer as a developer and said, here, I made the interface, there's a lot of other things that need to be taken into account. So earlier, remember how I said that I, as the designer, made this 100 pixels on the top and 100 pixels on the bottom to give it this width. A lot of times when working with developers, they don't realize those small little things mean a lot to me as a designer. So I may just do something like this, like that looks like it's about 60 pixels on the top and bottom and nothing on the side. Oops. And gives me this, not what I wanted it to look like. But let's just say we had that conversation, we made it 100. So this is the basic interface here. So it's 100 by 700 wide. However, when I look at inspect here, I have this defined as 700 and a border of 2 pixels in the padding top and bottom. If I go to computed and actually look at the width of this, you can see that it's actually 704 pixels. So why is this 704 pixels? In CSS, it interprets things like borders on the outside of the element. So I define this as 700, but it's 700 plus 2 pixels on each side, making it be 704. And the padding inside here is working appropriately. It's expanding both ways, up and down. To kind of overcome that, what we'll also do is one of these starting points that I like to do. So I'm going to use the star selector, which means it's applied to every single element. So if I added, just to show you how this works, if I added this element, lime, to everything, it outlines every single element inside my page as lime. Let me give it a better color so you can see it. Purples. Let's make it be like 2 pixels. So every single element is being bordered with outline. To apply something to every single attribute, I'm also going to use the pseudo selector after and before, which we will cover later. And I'm going to say box sizing, border box. Now, this is kind of a sledgehammer approach of adding a CSS property. So even though certain elements or certain CSS properties inherit from top to bottom or from parent to child nodes, star selector applies to every single element. Like if I wanted to apply Arial to every single thing on my page, I could add Arial up there. Would never do that, would never recommend that. But box sizing, this is one of those things, if your project isn't set up to use box sizing and you add it later on, you could break your interface. It's one of those decisions you have to make from the first moment that you're writing the code, and all the demos today are going to be utilizing this. So now by adding box sizing border box, and I highlight this, it's now at 700 pixels. So the difference of the default inside here versus like what we have, different browsers also interpret box sizing differently. So non-WebKit, so traditional browsers, there's content box. What are all the different, yeah, so content box, border box, or the primary inherit is whatever the browser does. I actually don't know what those two do. But border box, what it does is it looks at your width that you have defined and then applies all your padding inside. And it doesn't go outside the bounds. So if I have it defined as border box, my border isn't on the outside, it's on the inside of that 700. So my internal content is actually being subtracted by 4 as opposed to adding 2 on the outside, which is important when you're making grids. And like if you have a 3-column grid, those extra pixels on the side may cause your interface to jump down a line, even though mathematically it makes sense. Certain people will argue against using border box versus content box. No matter what, I still feel like from day one you need to make that decision. Content box means it's always going to be on the outside. Border box means it's always going to be on the inside calculation. For me, I just think if I'm defining something as 700 pixels, that when I'm adding a border or padding, that should remain as 700 pixels and not do the math. So for example, if I added content box here And let's just say I added padding on the sides of 100 pixels. Oops. Yep, so that became 904. I didn't see that update in the interface. So again, this is content box. You can see that this is 904 because it's the 2 on each side, 2 plus 2, 4, plus the 100 on each side, adding a 200 plus the 700 is 904. To me, that's a lot of mathematics that I don't need to do and think about when I'm building out an interface. That's why I go with border box. All right, so here we have this interface, and it's here, and the only thing that I don't have is the definition of the font size. It's 32. Now, the funny thing about this is I'm using an H1, and it's actually being calculated at 32 already, because the default user agent of an H1 is at 2M. So 2M, and my root font size of this project is 16 pixels, which is a browser. But let's just say, remember I was talking about this earlier, if we made the body font size 18 pixels. Now I look at this. This is at 18 at 2M, which would be 36. And that's coming from the 2N and interpreting the 18 font size here. I'm going to keep this back at 16, which will make it the right size. But for the sake of this demo, I'm going to give it a definition of font size 32 pixels. So now by doing that, this H1 has a 32 pixels being applied to it. And it's being defined on the H1 type selector. So if I updated this to be 100 pixels, that's still going to remain as 32. It's overriding that. And how I know that is if I look at the H1, it's defined as 32, but I can also see that it has the slashes through here on the user selector, as well as the slash on the body selector. So you can see all that, and you can also go to computed to do all that. To show you what the font size of 100 looks like, if you can't imagine, it's large. Hi. There's the 100, and there's the 32. All right, so this is where I'm going to stop on the first one, and then we're going to move to the next demo.
Jalen loves your shirt, by the way.
Oh, cool. Bernie 2020. The next example that we're going to do is another pretty traditional way of building out an interface. And I'm going to publish that out there. So GitHub takes a few moments to get out there, but in a second here, you will be able to see the code on this page. So give it a moment. It was just deployed. It should be fine. All right.
Did you deploy that repo?
Hmm?
You said you pushed that repo?
It's just the public page right now. Doing it.
404.
What? This? CWG.
Oh, okay.
It's a GitHub pages. Sorry. So nice transition. .github.io/cwg-ww-2019. All right, so that's out there. All right, so the next way that we're looking at this, so this is vertically centered right now in the page. But it's really not vertically centered. It's just using the padding top being equal. So right here and right here are the same, and that's how that's actually being centered in the page, which is a decent old school approach for doing this. So we look at this in the computed, so the padding on the top are the same here. Why is that doing that? Oh, it's on here. The padding on the top are the same. So it's giving that illusion that it's centered in the middle of the page. The next way of doing this, let's remove this. And what was the actual height of this? 236. All right. Say I'm a hardcore designer and I want things to be the way that I want them. So I can do line height 236. And there it is centered in the page. So how this is working is it is utilizing the line height inside here to push this element across vertically. If I made this 500, just to show you, it would be 500 pixels. Now, why this approach is kind of I mean, it works for like small things that are out there, not necessarily the best approach. Let's say I had 20 characters here. You can see that each of these lines are at 236, which is not great. But for purposes of today, that's the line height example. The only thing I changed here was just removing padding and doing this, still centered. So those should look 1 for 1. The next way is getting into kind of back into the agenda that we have here. We are going to talk about the table approach, which is the old school way of doing it. It's still very useful for today. Again, at this point, I'm still just using type selectors and haven't moved away from those. We will be going over those, switching over there in just a few moments. But again, just trying to keep it that way for right now. All right, so that one has been deployed out. So in old HTML, there was tables, there were table rows, there were table cells, and there were TD bodies and all these other things and all these DOM elements that were used all the time. So a table, right here, an element, you have table row, and then you have TD for the cell. So I have 2 cells, it looks like this. If I have 2 rows, it looks like this. Cool. And if I want to show you what those look like, let's just add a border, 1 pixel solid red. You can see that it's a table in a 2 by 2. If I wanted this table to be the full width, I would have to add 100%. And there it is. Tables, if I go like this and give it a width of 700 pixels, and let's just go to 1 cell. And for this table one, I'm going to add the background color here. Same thing that we did here, as well as border. What is this? Sorry, that was really annoying me. All right, so we have this table with the border and everything's going in there. If I want to make it centered, there it is. And then if I want my text to be aligned, I can do this. The cool thing with table is if I give it a height of 236, you can see that that's already kind of being centered in the page, which is not what I wanted to show you. Let's make it 536. Why is that doing that? Text line center. Well, that's cool. That is news to me that by default that's already vertically centered, which is cool. Table cell. Oh, you know what it was? I still have the line height. No, I don't. Huh. Anyways, in tables you have vertical, align, and there's different things that you can do. You can do top, you can do bottom, which you can't see that because it's at the bottom, and I can do middle. The great thing about tables are they are literally compatible with browsers from '96. So this same approach to do vertical, center, and middle has existed since the beginning of the web in CSS. Let's make this font size go back to 32 pixels. And let's make this be 236. So again, I can do alignment on tables. Now, this is a lot of DOM just to get this output. Not really that great. Let's make another version of this. Okay. And we'll call this table 2, table properties. So that's using the HTML elements to get there, but in reality, that is not the approach that I would recommend for you to do. So what we're going to do is take the same and we're going to switch it over to the original DOM that we had on the other page. So this was what we had, and we're going to uncomment this. And the difference between this and this is really the only difference of one extra wrapper. When you're dealing with HTML, things like that actually matter. I'm going to change this table. I'm going to do a comma, oops, and put a div here. So now this top one is getting the same styles because we're sharing it between the table and the div selector. And we're inheriting the font size inside there. The only difference is this doesn't have the weight, because remember earlier, I missed that earlier, font weight bold, they should all both be bold. So that's the only mess up in that previous one. It's kind of bothering me, but I'll let it go. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add H1 here. So the H1 property has a vertical align middle. Now, this is still being inherited and defined as a display block, which is a div. So if I look at the user agent, it has a display block, and the same thing with the H1 display block. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I want my div to be displayed as a table, and I want my H1 to be defined as a display table cell. Now, if I look at the browser, these two are identical. Even though this is a div element, it's being identified as a table. If I look at this table element and the user agent for it, it's a table. And if I look at this H1, it's a table cell. And if I look at the TD inside here, it is a table cell. And then it removes the inherit. Oh, that's weird. That's defined by the browser in your own settings in Computer. I never knew that. And this is being centered inside here. Even though this is a super old school approach, I still find myself using this all the time for simple cases. Especially, as I said earlier, this element, like these HTML elements are still used today in emails. Typically in an interface, even if I'm doing something that has a lot of tabular data and results, I'm probably going to be using more modern HTML elements. So that's what these are. And I'm just defining them as table. So here we get that output. The next one that we're going to put in here is blocks, and kind of going inside of a more normal way. What do I want to, I'm trying to think of the next one that I want to do first. Let's do block position. Let's do block transform. Okay. I have a Quad City DJ song stuck in my head.
Which one?
Come on, ride the train. Yeah, that's a great song. All right, so we're going to scrap this, but we're going to keep these base settings here. In this one, I'm also going to switch over from doing divs. Actually, I'm going to change the name of this to, this would be a better time of doing this, class approach. All right, cool. All right. So far I've been using type selectors. Earlier I talked about classes. I'm going to create a class here called container. And so a class again starts with a period. You apply them. So if I remove this, those aren't being applied anywhere. For this to work, I say class equals quotes, and I put the class name inside there and it gets applied. The beauty of this is I can have multiple classes on the page and it gets applied to everything. So classes are one-to-many, like many selectors. Really the only one that isn't is an ID. So here we have a class inside here, and this is a typical way of doing it. For centering of this one, we'll just do container h1. So what this is a selector, again, that has higher specificity. So what this is saying is an h1 that is directly inside of a container. So in this case, this h1 is directly inside container. So if I add a color, let's say blue inside here, it's being applied. But let's just add another wrapper here. That is now not being applied because the h1 is being separated. So for this CSS property and classes to be added, it needs to be a direct descendant of this node. Let's put that back. So now it's working. And for this guy, we're just going to go back to the old school and say line height 236. Bad example, but we're at least doing classes. In this one, what I'm going to do is this is class approach 2. I'm going to add a class to this called title. And I'm also going to call it we'll do title. I'm going to get rid of this. And then I'm going to call this theme. Typically, I would give this a better name. And this theme is going to be, oh, we'll call it dark theme. Theme dark. So in theme dark, I'm applying two different properties, which is the background being black and the color being white. Now, right now, container just has this border of red. I'm going to put theme dark inside here. So with classes, you can add multiple selectors and it applies those styles. So this is now getting the styles of theme dark as well as container. Because this red border, if this wasn't really needed inside my interface, I may not want to have that red border defined in there. So we can use container in multiple ways. So in CSS, you need to dissect your interface and decide how we can make this be as reusable as possible. So I could see myself wanting to use the dark theme where it's black with white text inside of it. Now with that, I probably don't want all my text to always be 32. So that's where it goes into the title. So now title gets the font size 32. Now this is where I may also want to define the font family here, but in this case of this interface, it's always going to be Arial and we're already inheriting it. But if there was something different that I wanted for all titles like text transform, uppercase to make it always capitalized, I could add it here. Now, why this is also really nice is let's take this over here, so an H2, and I'm going to say, yo, Quad City DJs, hit me up. They're great, great band. So earlier we defined, the font size, the root font size is 100 pixels, which is ridiculous. Let's go back to 16. So that's now font size 16. I can apply class title here, and now it has the same stylistic as this. The difference is this one's white, this one's black, because it's not inside of theme dark. If I added theme dark on body here, now they're both the same, because that's inheriting that. So this is why you kind of want to break these up, because you don't want to make a specific selector with properties and not make it be reusable. So in this case, we have it in two different ways. Now, the other thing, as I said, is we probably want the bold here. Now, I look at what's remaining in container. In my opinion, a container should just be the width and the alignment of it. So more of like treating it as an object. Inside here, we would want to create something more specific. So when you're creating CSS selector names, you want to try to make them be kind of unsemantic but semantic at the same time. So by that, I mean you want to give it a name that is reusable but not overly explicit. So one of the things where like CSS goes wrong in selectors is maybe I call it my red class, so it's .red. And that's because my primary brand font is red. But say our brand changes from red to blue. Then what I have to do is go through my entire interface and update all the classes in the DOM and make sure that that is found and replaced across everything. Where if I had it called something like primary color as opposed to red, then all I would have to do is update one line of CSS and it would update across my entire site. And it's less invasive. So keeping them in a way, in a naming convention that's easy to access and that you can utilize, but then making it be in a way that it's flexible for the ongoing future. So I guess we'll just call this like demo box. and just because I don't feel like thinking of anything. And this is where we're going to add some of the specifics that are only for this demo box. So text align, center, as well as the border on the background. Now, if I really wanted to, I could also apply demo box to dark theme and remove dark theme from here. I could also add demo box. So because I added demo box up here, I didn't need that dark theme anymore. And I could also add demo box to container. So this is getting all those styles inside there. Oops, put the wrong one there. So this is having one right here, but then it has the access of all of these. Why this is important is if I wanted to make another version of this that didn't have the background color being black, I could still go container, demo box. Oh, that's going to be the same. Let's remove this here. And now I have two different versions of it, like one's a light version, one's a dark version. Not really that interesting of an example, but I hope you get what I'm trying to show here in the breakdowns. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Andy, am I getting too much in the weeds?
No, you had it there.
All right, cool. All right, so with that, I was looking at Andy. He was giving me the I'm getting in the weeds type of look. All right, so here we have this demo of more of a broken down version of this. The next one here is going to utilize my favorite approach, which is BEM. So in that last version that I was just going over, I was talking about how the different elements and pieces can be utilized and reused from like one thing to another. And kind of the breakdown of like this parent-child thing. So let's go back and look at demo box. Oh, did I delete the demo box styles? If I did, I did not mean to. So let's just do that really quick. Yeah, I did. Oops. All right, cool. So in this approach, there's these titles and things that we want. So this title has a line height of 36, and that's how I'm centering it still on this page. Not a good approach. Again, the reason is if I add lorem and I put 40 here, it looks like this. Not great. What I actually want this to be is something like, if I do put this longer title here and I put 40, I probably only want this at a line height of like 1.3, which is a pretty traditional size. 1.5 is usually what you have for paragraphs. Height inside here, if I want this to be really tight, I make it 1. So let's put 1.3 here to give it some kind of spacing for any descenders and ascenders. So right now, this title is right here. It's in demo box. And so far, this is still kind of a nice name for it. But inside demo box, I'm going to create something. So demo box is kind of my outermost. And then I know title inside here is going to be my child. So in BEM, what you do is it stands for block element modifier. So in the case of BEM, what we could do is demo box, and I could say demo box dark. So this would be a modifier, 2 dashes. So if I add demo box and modifier. What am I saying? So in the I guess world of BEM, you have blocks, you have elements, and you have modifiers. Modifiers are defined as double dashes. It's a way to make something specific, but this demo box can be used in various ways. So if I wanted a dark theme, a light theme, it's easy for myself and the team to know demo box double dash dark is the dark version, double dash light is a light version, and so forth. So for child elements, what we have is demo box, double underscore, we'll call this title. Now, right now that's not doing anything, and let's make this shorter again. Hello, world. We're still at this really small height here. Inside of demo box, we are going to say demo-box, and we're going to create a style here. Double underscore title. And for this one, we'll give it, what do we want to do? We'll give it the line height of 32. And I will show you 236. I'll show you one thing why this doesn't work. So right now we have line height, title, and we have this element up here. So if I look at this, I'm like, I just defined title, and the title's here, and the line height's small. Earlier I was talking about the slashes that come through CSS. So we have demo box in the dark theme, and then you also see this out here. So adding those commas is also a nice little reference. If you want to give it like a really semantic name but never use it in your interface, that's also nice to do, because sometimes it's like a cheat sheet or helps you like self-comment. So you could give it a name, even though it's publicly available, like, hey, use this for blah, blah, blah. If you wanted to do that, you could do it. Sometimes I find myself doing stupid things like that, but it's helpful. If I look at this, even though I define demo box double underscore as title as line height 236, it is getting overwritten by this 1.3 title. Now, why this is happening is how CSS reads. So CSS reads from the top all the way down to the bottom of the file itself. So for me to actually override that, I have to either increase specificity. So let's add some details to this in H1. So H1, the type selector dot class has higher specificity, meaning it has higher definition than title itself. So it's going to overwin. So CSS has two different things that it uses. It reads from top to bottom, but then specificity is always going to win. So the more specific, the more selectors or different pieces that you're adding to your individual selector, the higher the specificity goes up, the higher the definition of this. So because these were both classes, they have equal specificity. So CSS is going to read from top to bottom and say the bottommost one at the bottom of the CSS file or sheet is going to win. But because I added this increase here, it stays, and this one actually wins the specificity war there. So the best way of doing this is to think about the order that you have. So we're going to do this. And I'm going to create a new one called 8. Specificity. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah, that's close enough. It is Friday. Saturday. Just kidding. All right, so in that last demo there, you know, oops, this still looks the same. What I want to do is follow this methodology called ITCSS or ITCSS. So if you do a search for ITCSS, Harry Roberts, you can watch this amazing video about ITCSS. Highly recommend it. I've done variations of interpreting this in other classes, so some of my older videos, I have that in there, but watch that, it's fantastic. So the idea of ITCSS is kind of with the idea that CSS reads from top to bottom and has specificity, the two core pieces of CSS that not too many people know. So again, this dilemma is a common thing that happens. Why it's so easy to identify right now is we only have a few lines of CSS, and I've been talking for over an hour about these few classes. So you probably know and could remember each one if I asked you. However, in a real project, you have thousands of lines of CSS and you may have multiple CSS files. So then to keep the order of it and to realize where something's happening, typically what people will do will just be increased specificity. This is not the right approach of how CSS should be. Earlier I said CSS is not a language of overriding, but it's a language of extending. So this slash right through here is on a class. You want to avoid that. So in ITCSS, the goal of ITCSS is to have your most far-reaching CSS at the very top of your CSS file, and the more specific or component-based designs at the bottom of the CSS. So at the top of it, you have things that are objects. So the container here is considered an object. It's very far-reaching, can be used many different places. But I may want to extend or even override a property inside there. And for me, I put that container or those objects at the top. Underneath there, I then can put in my actual components. So more stylistic things that are specific in this interface, like this, red border, black background. And at the very bottom of it, I put things that are utilities, helpers, or hardcore overrides. There's a lot more layers to it, but that's basically all you really need to know for today is far-reaching at the top, and the more specific it is to the actual interface, the more it goes to the bottom. So in organizing this, we'll put demo box here, and the title is very far-reaching because I would see that being used in my interface all the time. And then we would put the more theming stuff or utilities at the bottom. And so by just changing the order of this in the CSS, it goes from here to being here. So again, I have my far-reaching up here and more objects and global styles here, and then something that's more of a component down at the bottom. And here we have this. The next one here.
Hey, Kevin.
Yep.
How does this pyramid structure in ITCSS help you work better as a developer? What problems does it solve?
Yeah, I mean, it really gets over the primary issues that you have with how CSS is interpreted by the browser. It's something that if you're not following and you're not like know all the tips and kind of tricks of utilizing the browser for inspecting, or even understanding like which CSS selectors have higher specificity by definition versus another one, ITCSS helps you organize your code in the appropriate way. So it's all about organization of your code to prevent the general errors that we have as developers in writing code. Does that make sense? Orange bubbly.
Are they sponsoring today?
Yeah, yes. In Quad City DJs. Cool. So right here, again, far-reaching, more specific down here, and themes at the bottom. The next one is what I will call just ITCSS. To hit on this one more time, and then we're going to get back into the various versions of this. Is if we have something that is an object, let's call it with a O dash And this is also a great way to organize your code. It's something that I do. So if you look at any of my projects, this is how I prefix all my classes. So that's the only reason why I'm talking about it. If you ever look at any of my stuff and you wonder why it has this. So we have O, which stands for object. We have C, that stands for component. C for component. And then we have T, that stands for theme. And this would be a component. And different levels of components are really based off of, this is a very specific, this hello world with this red border and it being text aligned is, a literal specific component, where a component like ctitle is very used more frequently in the design. So what this also helps you identify when you're writing your code is what elements and how they should be used. So the O is like objects, very far-reaching. Don't add stylistic things. C dash means like you can add pretty much anything that you want and then just decide the order of it. A theme means that it's going to be like hardcore overriding or extending and adding something like, background color being a specific color or the font color being a very specific thing. So themes are at the bottom. And this also includes JS dash, which is if you need a class or something stylistically that's based around a JavaScript language. It also helps you identify those. And an underscore before it means like a hack. So like browsers, something for compatibility for browsers, especially if you still have to support like the IE 9s of the worlds and 8s. It happens. So with this demo, I'm also going to switch out two different things, and I'm going to actually remove. I'm going to keep this title. This is all good. Do I need this theme dark? I'm going to go back to like how I had this originally, and add these pieces inside here. Now, one of the things that I use also in my styles are pipes. So I just use that as a way to break up my code to identify core pieces. So by that, I do star star and something like this. Meaning this demo box is identified, like don't delete anything inside here. And then this is an extension for it. And something like this, I would put pipe, which means that these two are done together, and star star, meaning like if you remove anything inside these stars, you're going to break it. But this pipe means it's doing something different and stylistically, so they're almost like optional arguments, but these are the default behaviors. So applying some of the other logic of other things out there. I do this because some of the interfaces that we build are really complex, and almost every single component is used in 5 different thousand ways. And with that, we can take a block of code and be like, wait, what can I change here to get the result that I want? I know don't touch anything in the stars unless I know what I'm doing. Anything outside the stars, I can change. The pipes are kind of like grouped together. So I typically group them by the core component, and then things like typography. If typography is a core piece of that component, then I group those together and then pipe into something like the display of it and how it would actually align, and then something, I don't know, just the various ways, like typography, colors, also done that way. So inside here, I'm going to change a few quick things. So we're also going to add O container back here. So why don't I have a pipe there? It's because these are kind of still on the foundational side, and these are required for it to be centered in the page. The only difference is if I got rid of this, it would remove the background color of it. So if I copy this and do this, that's changed. Oops, I'm on the wrong one. So these two are the same, but these two are the same. Oh, I lost my demo box. So these two are the same, but one has the dark theme and one has a non-theme associated with it. And I can keep that structure, reuse it, make different things. All right, so dark. That is basically a good approach for explaining ITCSS and also naming conventions for your classes. That can be confusing for someone that has never done it. I like to recommend it, but I don't really hold anyone that true to it. If your project is following some kind of convention, follow the conventions of it. Don't create your own conventions because then someone's going to get really mad and get into an argument about spaces and tabs with you, and you're going to lose 8 hours of your day, and you may punch someone or quit your job. So I've seen that.
It's not a Quad City DJ move either.
It is not. That is not how you get funky. I think they say that.
It's not how you ride the train.
Yeah. Choo choo train. It's now horribly stuck in my head. All right. One of the things that I didn't really fix yet is this demo box title. So now that we have this demo box title inside here, and demo box has this background color. I don't know if demo box having this background color is really the right theme for this. So what we can also do is we can create a utility called like border secondary, something like that, which is going to add, oops, you know, a nice helpful red border. Oh, I keep hitting X. And we're also going to add this here. And those are like things. Now in CBox demo, anytime CBox is being used, it's going to be centered horizontally. But I need this to be at a height of 236 pixels. What I'm probably going to do is say a minimum of 236, a min height of 236. What this gives me is, if I were to add lorem 5000 and hit enter, it will grow past that, but it will never go below 236, which is nice. Now that I have that, I'm going to move into the next approach. And I'm going to start speeding up here. That's embarrassing. So in this one, we are also going to add a position relative. This is a great approach to actually center vertically and horizontally inside of any element. I still use this in many different cases. So this is using position relative and position absolute. So right now, this is being pushed off the side. So by default, position absolute is going to move it. So the parent of CBox underscore title, it is a child of CBox, and this has a relative. So this space is going to be relative to this. If I remove this relative here, what happens is this will actually extend outside, or it should one way or another. I don't know why that didn't happen. Oh, I know why. So if I go left and I put 0 here and top here, you'll see it go outside of the bounds. Let's make it yellow so you can see it. So you, red. So you can see that this is going outside the parent. That's not what we want. If I put relative, anything that's inside of it, so this C title absolute is now relative to this C box demo. And that's how positioning works. So an absolute is going to be relative to its parent or the closest relative parent inside the node of your HTML. Right now, this is just in the top and the left. We're going to try to center this first vertically. I mean, horizontally. There's a bunch of different ways that we can do this. If I do this and I say outline 1 pixels line, you can see that it's not the full width. Even though this is a display block, it is now only going to the width of the characters inside here. If I add more characters, it's going to expand out. So an approach for me to make this is I can do 100%, and it's 100% width. I could also say right 0, left 0, and it's going to expand from left to right. So it's expanding that entire thing from left to right. We'll keep it as a width of 100% for right now. And it is being centered because it's inheriting the text align center from the parent. So cool. Now we have the horizontal piece working. Now to make this vertical, what I need to do is say top. Now if I say top 50%, that kind of looks like it's in the center, but it's only, it takes into account the height of this element. So let's outline this again. You see this? The true center is about the difference of this to right here, which is truly it. If I make this be longer, let's just add a line break and say, yo. You can see that that's even getting worse. And if I say this and I say, sup, you can see that that's completely off. So it's not calculating the height. So the only way that I can make that happen is to use transform. And I say transform, translate on the Y negative 50%. Now it is centered vertically inside here. And it's done that way. So now if I remove this and make it one line, we have it vertically centered and we don't need it red anymore. So this approach works in a lot of use cases, but that's a lot of code to make this happen. So how that's happening is you need to have a parent that has a relative, you need the child to be an absolute, and then you need to make it either be the full width or a defined width, and then you need to make it be 50% from the top, from the absolute top, and then you need to do a translate of 50% for that offset. It's a lot of code, but it works, and this is a great approach. However, if my code or my content here is greater than the height of it, look what happens. Remember earlier I said that this had a min height of 236 and it was growing? This does not grow because the absolute position does not actually have a defined height, and this is getting cut off from both sides and expanding outside. The next one, we will fix that. But if you know like a button or something or some kind of like interface, great solution. Is the next thing on there flex? Is that what it was? I believe so. Yep, flex.
Flex grid and then weird.
Yeah. Weird will be great.
You got about 40 minutes until 12:30.
All right. This one, so I think that, like up to here, this is going to go through really quick because flex is the easiest solution. It's probably the best solution for today. And I would say most widely used and compatible wherever you're going to be doing it. So we're going to keep the same styles here, and now I really have this just broken down into a min height. So in the last one, remember how if I grew this to be really tall, it expanded out. This will resolve that. We're going to get rid of the absolute stuff here, as well as the width and everything. The only thing that we're keeping in here is, is the height of 236. For this parent, I'm also going to get rid of this text align center, so it's going to be right there. I'm going to give it a display flex. So right now this doesn't look like anything. Let me outline this. Oops. It is now at that full width, but you can see that it's at the full height. So it's calculating a little bit differently than everything that we've talked about so far. For me to make this be horizontally centered, there's different approaches, but this is probably the best way of doing it. Justify content, and you say center. So now it's centered in the page. So justify content center. Flex also has what is referred to as flex end, which would be on the right side, and flex start, which is at the beginning. So flex uses an X and Y coordinates or positioning to move things across the interface. So here we want it to be centered. But we also want it to be align content center. Oops. Oh, align items center. Based off this, you can see that it is doing everything that we wanted to do in the last one, but it's only these 3 lines of code. And I don't even have to do anything on the child. So it's from the parent to the child relationship. Now, this has a min height of 236. If I add 4000 here and hit enter, you can see that this grows to be the full height. And earlier I said that the height of this wasn't actually supposed to be 236. What it was supposed to be padding top 100 pixels and padding bottom 100 pixels. So now we have this, and it goes that way and grows. But we can now make this be a height of 600 pixels or whatever it is, because the design has changed and it's still there, but it has a top and bottom of 100 pixels. Or I can change this to be whatever value I want it to be. If I want it to be the full height, VH, it goes that way. Cool. Now, I'm going to show you another thing with Flex, kind of the reverse. So by default, Flex sees the Flex direction as a row. If I change this to Flex direction, column, this is going to be doing the exact same thing. And you're like, all right, well, all you did was add another CSS property. The difference of this versus the default row is how these are interpreted. So let me show you. I'm going to comment that out, and I'm going to comment out this. Flex row. Oops. Flex row right now is the default. So if I remove this, it's still going to be that exact same thing. Let's get rid of this for this demo. So it's up there at the top. Flex row, I'm over defining it. If I say justify content, which is going to center this in the page. If I change this to column, which is the other option here, it goes over here. So the difference between flex and row and column is how you're looking at those coordinates. They're kind of turned to the side. So when I have it as row, it's centering it in the middle of the page. And if I do align items, it's vertical. If I do column, it becomes the exact opposite of it. So if I remove the justify content, the align items becomes the center horizontally, whereas in here, it is the exact opposite. It becomes a vertical line. That is one of the trickiest things with Flex, and it confuses the daylights out of most people. But just showing like that quick little demo of it helps you understand of how it does. So again, align and justify kind of flip their meanings based off of whether it's column or row. This next one is using grid. So grid is very similar to Flex in the simplicity of what you can do. Grid offers a lot of great building out interfaces in a short amount of time with very minimal code. It's very powerful. I typically only use grid on global structures, so something like a header, main section, footer, something that I want to define as the core of my interface, or some tabular data that's really complex. Those are the primary uses of it. Any other use of it, it kind of gets more complicated than needed. Flex is usually the best approach today, or even using table cells as we talked about for certain things. So I'm going to show you what grid does. Here we have grid. So right now, this isn't doing much, and if I look at this, it's just being a display grid. But what I can do is, let's do grid template columns 1FR, and we can also do text align here, center, and it goes here. If I outline this, you can see the difference of what's happening. 1FR means one fraction. So the cool thing with grid is if I had two different columns here, like one fraction and two fraction, it creates this grid for me. So if we wanted to break this up in a weird way, let's do this. Where we have hello over here and world in another one. I don't know why you would ever do this, but you definitely can. Oh, this is actually going to be an annoying demo. I'll just call it first of type. Oop. Let's do first child. Really stupid demo, but you can see that these are equal parts and they're on this grid right here. So if I didn't want these to be equal parts, I could do something like this is now at 2/3. It pushes over there, or I want the first one to be at 100 pixels. It's at a defined 100 pixels, and this one's moving over. Or I could do the reverse and say I want this one to be 200 pixels and this one to be one fraction. Or I could also do as one auto. So there's a lot of amazing things that you can do with grid. The grid template columns as well as rows are the most useful for it. The annoying thing with rows are, in this case, we only have one row. Grid, row, grid, yeah, there we go. Grid template rows. If I define these all as auto, which is the default. Doesn't really matter that much. But if I add a second level of this, you can see that it does this, which is great. Let's just do child odd. Right now these are the same, but if I went like this and I said I want the first one to be 50 pixels and the second one to be auto, there we have that. But now let's add a third row in here. I could say I want the first one to be 50, I want the second one to be 100, and then the last one is just kind of auto on its own. If I wanted to make this be a repeat, I have to say repeat and say 3, or how many times I want it, and then it repeats it. So it goes 50, 100, 50. If there was a fourth row, it would also get it. It's just kind of an annoying way of thinking about interface design. That's why I think it's best for the outermost. Anyways, let's simplify this and get back to something that isn't as silly as this. Hello, world. All right, so we're going to do a line items center, very similar to the last one. This is the annoying thing, is Flex uses align content, but Grid uses items. I don't know why that decision was made, because it's very confusing. So Grid uses justify items, and Flex uses justify content. No clear understanding on why that is. It just is. Because it confuses me sometimes if I'm going back and forth and I'm writing something in Flex. I'm like, why isn't this working? And then I realize I'm using the wrong property. So they're not compatible back and forth. Everything else kind of works the exact same. So again, Grid works the same way as Flex. If I add additional content, it's going to grow inside there. Cool. So this is getting into some of the weird approaches, and then I'm just going to hit on some really quick ones, which are going to cover a bunch of CSS stuff, and then we'll open up to questions. So say that you don't know how to CSS, but you do know how to save an image. Guess what? The web works with images. So remember earlier I saved out that image. What did I call it? Graphic.png. And I say hello world. Here we go. That is literally just the image on here. I have seen developers do this. I have seen this in production where people want something in the interface, but because CSS is so complicated, they save out an image. Why this is annoying is this is an image. I can't copy this. This isn't responsive. This doesn't transform or translate based off of my device. Yes, it works. Yes, this is the output. Yes, it looks just like everything else that we've seen today, but it's an image. At least I did the nice thing of adding an alt tag. So if this image is broken, hey, look at that. It's still showing up, kind of, and screen readers can read it. But let's just stay down this little happy path, and let's make it centered. And we'll just give it a dumb type selector too. We'll give it a display block, because if you don't, they're by definition inline blocks, so it interprets a line height. So if you do a display block, flex, or anything like that, it's going to remove this additional padding. So if you're ever putting an image in something, and you're like, why does this image not align, and why is there space underneath? It's just because it's an inline block, and it uses the line height around it. And we went through those demos of line height. It can be a pain. So kind of give it a definition. And we'll do we'll do a width of 100%. Look at it blow up. And then we'll give it a max width of 700 pixels. And then we'll do a margin left auto. Oops. And we'll do a margin right auto. Look at that. That is an image. So it's image tag source, quotes, and the reference to where it is in the directory. This is a relative path to it, alt tag, and that inside there. Earlier I was mentioning this, href for links. Really its own edge case because JavaScript files use source. So if I wanted to add a JavaScript file, I would say script, and then I would say source, and the reference to it. For some reason, HTML uses the href just because it's the link tag. All right, that's an image. 15. Pseudos. All right. So I'm gonna backtrack here and take the grid stuff here and move it over to pseudo. So this is back to the HTML version. Say I wanted to be really ridiculous, and I didn't want this. I can add borders in various ways around something. And I've seen a lot of stupid code out there and people that overcomplicate things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say a before. Now, what a before is I can add content before something. I can say, hi. And you can see that the hi is being added there. This content is coming from CSS, which is like stylistic. These are primarily meant for like glyphs or like icons or accent pieces that you don't want to write your code for, but you want to have some kind of element. But what we can do for creating that border is we can say content where it's creating a blank element. And then for this, I'm going to give it a position relative and say position absolute. And I'm going to say top -1, right -1. And I'm going to say bottom -1, left -1 pixel. Actually, these were 2 pixels, weren't they? So right now, this doesn't look like anything, but let's add a background color of red. And we've now made our border. If I change the Z index to -1. So that's how you can make your own border, which there's really no great use case of this. This is just stupid. There are times where I do things like this, but it's usually in layering effects. Pseudo classes are really fantastic. So I'm going to continue with actually a better use case of this. You can make anything into an interface, or you can make the dumbest decisions of all time. The only thing I'll apologize for is going on rants today, as well as my GitHub. The log for it all has the exact same commit name, so don't follow that. Yeah, that's what I'm doing here. It's just like adding it, yeah, and pushing it out. I didn't really have that much time to think about bringing like the file name. I was like, no one's gonna. What do they say? Don't shoot the messenger. Just
shoot the DJ, ride the train.
Ride the train. So anyways, we're going to have the word world here. And I'm going to remove this idiotic approach. And I'm just going to add that U border primary back in here. I immediately do that by default. Oh, secondary. Why would I call it secondary? Anyways, we've removed that and we're just using a grid right now on here. For this title, we're going to say like before. So right now it just says world. I'm going to say content and I'm going to say hello. Hello. So now we've added that in there. Why this is nice is to do something like this. When I've done different websites for different languages, where something in the interface is more stylistic, it's nice because there are extensions that you can use. You can look at the EN US right here. So if this was ES, let's say this. So let's say, what is that, lang? Yeah. Lang is equal to ES, then content for this will be hola. No. Oh no, no. No, I don't. Never this site. Oh, now it's confused. Oh, what have I done? All right, so what this is using is an attribute selector. So it's saying the attribute language when it's equal to ES, make the content be hola. And then by default, it won't have that. So if this doesn't exist, it's hello. Or if it's EN, English, it comes out across as English. If it says S, it says hola. Nice. What am I up to? We have 15 minutes. Do you want me to take questions right now, so we stay on track? Because I can go down many various paths, and like I can show some additional selectors and really stupid, weird ways that I've seen people build out interfaces to do things. The last thing I'm going to just show real quick is the designer comes to me, we're ready to launch this. And they say, I think I skipped a number, but center all. And I'm going to just go back to more of the approach that I would typically take for this. And if I was going to take this, we can also remove this element right here if we wanted to. And for this, this is also like the beauty of having, using grid inside here is the selector that I only need here. We can make this be an H1. And it just says hello, hello world. So one element, align items, justify content because I made this flex. It's in the middle. So to get this centered, I don't need multiple DOM wrappers when I'm using flex or grid. It can just be one thing. Now, if I wanted this to not just be here, because my designer's like, well, didn't you see my design? It was not supposed to be at the top of the page. And you're like, oh, well, how do you want that to be centered? You said 700 pixels. We never said how far away from the top. They're like, I want it to be centered in the page. And you're like, wow, that's a difficult thing to do. But if I'm already centering this here, how do I go and approach that? So let's look at that. What I'll do is I'll create something here. I'll say, actually, we'll make this be a utility because this is going to be like kind of a overriding. That's a stupid name. All right, so center all. I'm going to add we'll do this. And also add. So this guy, I always want it to be centered. It's kind of a different stylistic thing here. So that's centered in the page. I created uCenterAll as a utility helper class here. What I can also do is I can apply that to body. Now, the one thing about this is body, by default, if I look at the inspect of this, womp womp, only goes to 236 because the content isn't large enough. Now, if I make it be more than 400, body is much taller here, and it's also doing this funny thing of back and forth here. But basically, the height gets bigger, but it's based off the content that's inside the browser. So that's not really that helpful for me. So what I can say is I can create another utility helper called like min height, height full. And I can use one of my favorite CSS properties is 100 VH, which stands for 100 vertical height. If you do 50, it's 50 vertical height, so it's 50 of the height of the page, of the viewport. So it's based off viewport width or height. So if I do min height here, and I add it to here, now it's centered in the middle of the page. So using that class two different ways, and I've added a min height to body, I get this effect of it being centered in the page in any which way. But then once I get small enough, oops. So it's centered vertically and horizontally in the page. But if I make this even smaller, it'll still scroll for me. So I've created a few different interfaces and like pop-up libraries based off of a few CSS properties, just utilizing this trick of like 100% height and then utilizing the natural scroller WebKit scrolling inside here to give you this like overflow look and making sure that's centered in the middle of the page, which is fantastic. So all that is the min height here. And then we're utilizing that uCenterAll utility class on all of these, and this is getting centered inside the middle of the page. I could also create all of this with just one HTML element and nothing else besides using HTML body, and yeah, that would be all I would need. So different things. This is where I'm going to stop talking and see if there's questions.
Yeah, so we do have a question.
Okay.
Steve wants to know if you can clarify those pipes and asterisks, the functionality being interpreted in the DOM, or rather just useful annotations?
Purely useful annotation for organization of your code. And that's just because we, like in the projects we do, we use object-oriented CSS. So it's a combination of things like this. So if you look at this, this is a lot to interpret, and that could be confusing to an individual. So these are all about grouping things that are like-minded and then extensions of it. So grouping things together. So if I had additional, like, broken out to be like title, and then like I had title colors, I could put them right there. So purely annotation. I see it as self-documenting. Meanwhile, I'm going to build the one version. which is not a good approach, but and 18 is my favorite number. 18 is almost 1,000.
Yeah.
It's part of the way there.
Yeah.
In some cultures.
Yeah, it really is. You know, 18's on a, like, from the beginning of time, it's one of those numbers that is used like in religion in different cultures. I never knew that until I got 18 on the back of my head and someone came up to me and was like, oh, why do you have this? And I was just like, this is the day I was born. Nothing more than that. So again, these demos that I put together, these are not necessarily things that are best practices. The best practices are definitely the float one, the translate one, the grid one's great, and these are just ways to kind of interpret and see how CSS can build and hit on various properties. As I'm waiting for additional questions, I'm going to build out the crazy version. So,
Can you build out a crazy version?
oh, thanks. I thought no one would ask. Okay. 100 VH. Display. We'll take these so I don't have to retype it. Actually, yeah. Haha. Body. Background. Color. Border. 2 pixels. Solid red. Font size 32. Color white. Width 236. Oops, width is 700. Height 236. Okay. Actually, this will be a no element. And with this, this is literally the interface built out with no HTML element. So if I look at the view source here, well, I'm using some of the prefixer stuff, but if you look at this inside of, do this and update this in here. Give it a second. When that one comes out there and you look at the view source, there'll be nothing inside of this element. And this was all built just purely from CSS with nothing else there. So it still does the exact same things as what I showed earlier, but it's just doing this. So I think that's kind of cool. If I wanted to overcome like some of the responsive side ness here, so this was at 700 pixels wide. What I can say is body before, and I can say at media, screen, and min width, 700 pixels. And I will make this have a max width and a width of 100. Oh. Why did that just happen? Maybe I can't do that on the pseudo element. Struck down. You know, this is what they say. The devil's in the details. Yes. That's because I did it as flex. Oh, it's doing that to me. I struggle here. Well, I should backtrack. Oh, shoot, and I'm doing this in the wrong one. I'll go back and make the other version before this responsive. Fail on that one. Any questions?
No more questions.
All right.
I'd say we're about at time.
I just want to do this last one and call it RWD. For those that are curious about this, this will be way easier than using a single element. It's okay, Steve. RWD. And this one, so this is a little bit cleaner than what I was trying to do on the single one. And this would be somewhat more realistic. And we would apply it to this container. So this would be a very, very realistic approach here. And then what we would just do is take this, and to make this be responsive, we'd say at media, screen, which is a feature, and then the type that we want inside here is the width property. And I'm going to say 740 pixels because I want this to have gutters on the side of 20 pixels. So OContainer goes inside the media query. And when it is a min width of 740, I want it to have margin right auto. And then when it has a max, I'm going to have 20 pixels on each side to give it that fluid feel. So we're above, and then we go below and it has the 20 pixels on the side. So 20 plus 20, 40 right there. And this is above 740. We have the full width. And at 740, we have the gutters and flip out those. Oops. The only thing there is, let's again show that. And again, that works. So that's that. Cool. So just kind of wrapping up on everything here. So the goal of this, presentation was to kind of walk through, show you this demo and the many various ways that there are to build out something in CSS. I mean, I could talk all day long about the more various approaches to this, but I just kind of want to hit on the top of them. If there's anything that you guys have from a question standpoint, you can reach out to me. As I said, I'm Nice Transition on GitHub. I'm Nice Transition on Twitter. And I provide my email to the people that sign up for this workshop. So feel free to reach out to me. If you are in the Columbus area, I'm always down to meet up for a coffee or to do some one-on-one time. If you have some issues with CSS, I love solving problems, especially if they're kind of like out of the ordinary. I love those little challenges, but please don't hesitate to reach out. And I do want to plug Bernie Sanders 2020. I want to plug that our next Columbus Web Group event is August 29th, and we have Jacqueline Reinhardt, and she is presenting about confessions of being an appaholic. So she's talking about her career and her story to get to where she is today. She has an amazing app. It's called Shuffle. It's this cool concept that you can create playlists for your weekends, for your days, or when you're traveling. So the same way that you would maybe make a playlist for a party that you're throwing, you can make a playlist for an upcoming weekend, or when friends are coming in town, or a trip that you have, and you identify like all the things that you're doing, and you can share that publicly. So if you made a playlist like my visit to New York, you can see other people and what they did in New York. Fantastic app, and she has a fantastic story, just fantastic. So she'll be presenting August 29th. That's from 6 to 8 p.m. It's here in Columbus. We're still finalizing the details of the location, but I hope to see you guys come out. It should be a fun event, and Andy will be there. Steve will be there. I'll be there. We'll be partying. That's it. So thank you guys. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Is this where we're done?